December 1940. While bombs fell on London and flames consumed Britain's cities, a different kind of devastation was unfolding in the underground corridors of Whitehall. This destruction was silent, invisible to the crowds sheltering in the tube stations below. It was financial, and it would prove more permanent than any damage the Luftwaffe could inflict. Winston Churchill sat alone in the cabinet war rooms, surrounded by maps showing German advances across Europe. But the document before him wasn't a battle plan. It was something far more humiliating. A letter to Franklin Roosevelt that would effectively declare the British Empire bankrupt. Churchill, who could move millions with his words, who had promised blood, toil, tears, and sweat, now had to craft sentences that would beg America for money. Not as an equal, not as a partner, but as a debtor pleading for more time. The irony was crushing. Britain controlled a quarter of the world's surface. The sun never set on British territory. From Canada to India, from Australia to Africa, the pink portions of the map suggested unlimited wealth and resources. But it was a mirage. The empire was a facade held together by credit that was about to run out. To understand how the world's greatest empire could reach such desperation, we need to grasp the economics of modern warfare. This wasn't the 19th century anymore, where wars were fought by professional armies in distant colonies. World War II was industrial annihilation on a scale humanity had never witnessed. When war erupted in September 1939, Britain appeared financially invincible. The treasury held massive gold reserves. British investors owned railways spanning South America, mines dotting Africa, and factories across the United States. The City of London still dominated global finance, insurance, and trade. Britain was the world's banker, as it had been for over a century. But Hitler had unleashed something new: mechanized total war. This conflict devoured resources at an apocalyptic rate. Steel, aluminum, oil, rubber, explosives. The appetite was insatiable. And Britain's fundamental problem was geography. It was an island. It couldn't feed itself. It couldn't fuel itself. It had to import everything. And with Europe under Nazi control, there was only one place to turn: the United States. Here's where the trap was set. The United States in 1940 was officially neutral. The American people had vivid memories of World War I, when their sons died in French trenches for reasons many never fully understood. The political mood was fiercely isolationist. Stay out of Europe's problems. Let them destroy each other if they must. Congress had passed legislation called the Neutrality Acts, specifically designed to prevent America from being dragged into foreign wars. These laws contained a provision that would strangle Britain: cash and carry. The cash and carry clause was simple and brutal. Britain could buy American weapons, food, and supplies, but only if they paid immediately, in cash, preferably gold. And Britain had to transport everything on British ships, at Britain's risk. No loans, no credit, no payment plans. The Americans would happily manufacture the weapons Britain needed to survive. But they demanded payment up front, in hard currency, before the cargo left American docks. For the first year of war, Britain hemorrhaged wealth to meet these demands. They liquidated centuries of accumulated capital. Gold bars that had sat in Bank of England vaults since the Napoleonic Wars were now being crated up and shipped across the Atlantic. The operation was codenamed Operation Fish, and it was the largest transfer of physical wealth in human history. Battleships and ocean liners, their passenger compartments ripped out and replaced with shelving, carried Britain's entire gold reserve to Canada. Billions of dollars in gold, securities, and negotiable bonds crossed the U-boat-infested Atlantic in convoys that, if sunk, would have instantly bankrupted the nation. By autumn 1940, the gold was gone. The easily liquidated assets were gone. British purchasing agents in Washington were sitting on contracts for desperately needed aircraft and ammunition, but Treasury officials in London were sending cables saying, "We have no money. We cannot pay." This was the crisis that forced Churchill to write his letter to Roosevelt. The British were about to default, and if they defaulted, American suppliers would stop shipping. And if the supplies stopped, Britain would fall within months. Roosevelt understood the stakes perfectly. If Britain collapsed, Nazi Germany would control all of Europe. The United States would face a hostile superpower across the Atlantic. But Roosevelt also faced a political minefield. He couldn't just give Britain money. American law forbade it. The American public would revolt. He needed something that looked like business, not charity. This is where Lend-Lease was conceived. Roosevelt sold it to the American public with folksy wisdom. He used the metaphor of a garden hose. If your neighbor's house is burning, you don't negotiate the price of your hose. You lend it to him. He uses it to fight the fire. When the fire's out, he returns it. Simple. Neighborly. American. The American people bought this story. Congress eventually passed the Lend-Lease Act. Britain was saved. Or so it seemed. But behind the closed doors of the Treasury Department, a very different transaction was taking place. This wasn't neighbors helping neighbors. This was a foreclosure. And the man wielding the gavel was Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr. Morgenthau hated the Nazis. He was desperate to help Britain defeat Hitler. But he had another loyalty, to the American taxpayer. And he was determined that before America gave Britain a single dollar, Britain had to prove it was completely, utterly, thoroughly broke. Morgenthau demanded something unprecedented, a complete financial audit of the British Empire. He wanted lists. He wanted valuations. He wanted to know every asset owned by the British government and every major asset owned by private British citizens anywhere on Earth. The British negotiators were stunned. Sir Frederick Phillips, leading the British team, couldn't believe what he was hearing. Britain was fighting for civilization. British cities were being bombed every night. British ships were being sunk in the Atlantic. And now they were being treated like a bankrupt corporation in receivership, forced to open their books to foreign auditors. Phillips tried to reason with Morgenthau. He explained that Britain had already sold its gold. He argued that forcing Britain to liquidate long-term investments during wartime would be financial suicide. Assets would sell for a fraction of their value. And stripping Britain of overseas income would leave the nation destitute when peace finally came. Morgenthau's response was ice cold. His orders from Roosevelt were clear: prove you're broke or no aid. The political logic was airtight. If Britain still owned factories in America, why should American farmers and workers subsidize Britain's war? Congress would never approve aid to a nation that still had assets to sell. The symbol of this forced liquidation became American Viscose Corporation. American Viscose was an industrial colossus, the largest manufacturer of rayon and artificial silk in the United States. It was owned by the British company Courtaulds. It was profitable, modern, and efficient, generating millions in annual dividends that flowed back to London. Morgenthau identified it as his target. He told the British, "Sell it. Liquidate it. We want the cash deposited in the Treasury to pay for weapons you've already ordered." The British were horrified. They knew American Viscose was worth at least $120 million in a fair sale. But this wouldn't be a fair sale. Everyone would know Britain was being forced to sell. The vultures would circle. Morgenthau didn't care. He had leverage. The Lend-Lease bill was moving through Congress, and isolationist politicians were attacking it. They claimed Britain was secretly wealthy and trying to trick America into paying its bills. Morgenthau needed proof of British poverty. He needed a sacrifice. The ultimatum was delivered: sell American Viscose, or Lend-Lease dies in committee. On March 15, 1941, the British government seized American Viscose from its British shareholders using emergency war powers. They didn't ask permission. It was compulsory acquisition, justified by national survival. The sale was organized by American investment banks who knew exactly how desperate Britain was. They negotiated like loan sharks. The final price was approximately $54 million, roughly half of the company's actual value. It was legalized theft, enabled by Britain's weakness. The British government had to compensate Courtaulds in pounds sterling back home, adding to domestic debt, while the dollars went straight to the U.S. Treasury to pay for shells and airplane engines. This was the moment the British establishment understood the true nature of the special relationship. They weren't partners. They were a distressed asset being stripped by creditors. The United States wasn't conquering the British Empire with tanks. It was acquiring it through forced sales. But the liquidation didn't stop with corporate assets. It extended to the strategic foundations of imperial power itself. Britain desperately needed destroyers. German U-boats were sinking merchant ships faster than British shipyards could build replacements. The Atlantic lifeline was being severed. Without it, Britain would starve. Churchill begged Roosevelt for destroyers. The U.S. Navy had 50 Old World War I-era destroyers sitting in mothballs. They were obsolete, outdated, and barely useful to the modern American fleet. Roosevelt agreed to transfer them. But there was a price. In exchange for 50 rusting destroyers that were nearly worthless, the United States demanded 99-year leases on British military bases spanning the Western Hemisphere. Newfoundland, Bermuda, the Bahamas, Jamaica, Antigua, St. Lucia, Trinidad, British Guiana. Read that again. 99-year leases. Nearly a century of American military presence on British sovereign territory. Bases from which the United States could project power across the Caribbean and the North Atlantic. For 50 obsolete ships that could barely make it across the Atlantic. It was the geopolitical equivalent of a pawn shop transaction. Britain was trading strategic assets accumulated over centuries for short-term tactical survival. It was the act of a desperate nation pawning family heirlooms to buy groceries. By March 1941, when the Lend-Lease Act finally passed, Britain had been stripped to the bone. The gold was gone. The American investments were sold. The naval bases were leased. The treasury was empty. Lend-Lease was celebrated as the arsenal of democracy. Newspapers portrayed it as American generosity, saving Britain from Nazi tyranny. And in many ways, this was true. The aid, tanks, aircraft, food, fuel, kept Britain alive. Without it, Britain would have fallen. But the financial architecture of Lend-Lease laid the groundwork for a post-war world where Britain would be a junior partner, and America would be the dominant power. Crucially, Lend-Lease was not a gift. It was a lease. The name itself implied future payment. And buried in the agreement was Article 7, a clause written in dry diplomatic language that contained a poison pill for the British Empire. Article 7 required Britain to agree, in principle, to dismantle imperial preference after the war. Imperial preference was the economic glue holding the British Empire together. It was a system of tariffs that made British goods cheaper in empire markets than foreign goods. When Canada or Australia or India bought manufactured products, British items had a built-in price advantage. This protected British industry from more efficient American competition. By signing Article 7, Britain was agreeing to tear down its own economic walls. They were agreeing to let American companies compete on equal terms in empire markets. They were signing away the economic logic of empire itself. British negotiators fought against Article 7. They understood it meant the end of the empire as an integrated economic system. But German bombers were overhead. U-boats were sinking ships. The alternative was surrender. They signed. As 1941 became 1942, and America officially entered the war after Pearl Harbor, the relationship shifted again. Now Britain and America were allies, fighting side by side. American troops poured into Britain. The British Isles became a giant aircraft carrier for American bombers striking Germany. But the financial imbalance only widened. American industry, fueled by government spending, exploded in scale and efficiency. U.S. GDP grew by massive percentages year after year. American factories produced bombers and tanks, but also refrigerators, radios, cars, and consumer goods for global markets. British industry, meanwhile, was being cannibalized by the war. Every factory was converted to military production. Britain stopped exporting entirely. It abandoned commercial markets in Latin America, the Middle East, and Asia. And who filled those markets? American companies. While British factories made Spitfires, American factories made Spitfires and everything else. The United States was fighting the war while simultaneously capturing Britain's commercial future. By 1944, the wealth transfer was complete. The world's gold reserves had shifted from London to Fort Knox. The financial center of global capitalism had crossed the Atlantic permanently. British leaders believed their sacrifice would be remembered. They believed that because they had stood alone against Hitler for 2 years, because they had bankrupted themselves defending freedom, America would treat them generously after the war. They believed Lend-Lease would continue during Reconstruction. They believed there would be a soft landing. They were catastrophically wrong. They had forgotten the lesson of the viscose sale. In international finance, gratitude is not legal tender. The moment the war ended, the bill came due, and the shock would shatter what remained of British power. August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered. World War II was over. In London, crowds flooded the streets. Bonfires lit up the night. Strangers embraced, weeping with joy. The British Empire had endured 6 years of hell and emerged victorious. In Washington, there were no tears. There was only bureaucracy. 7 days after VJ Day, President Truman signed an executive order terminating Lend-Lease. Immediately. No transition. No warning. No grace period. The cutoff was absolute. American ships already mid-Atlantic, loaded with food and raw materials bound for British ports, were ordered to turn around and return to the United States. The lifeline was severed. The British government was paralyzed with shock. They had assumed aid would continue during Reconstruction. They had assumed their economy, completely distorted by 6 years of total war, would be given time to adjust to peace. John Maynard Keynes, the most brilliant economist of the century, examined the numbers and saw catastrophe. Britain was importing half its food and nearly all its raw materials, paying with Lend-Lease dollars. Without those dollars, Britain was instantly insolvent. Keynes calculated that Britain faced what he called a financial Dunkirk. The country would have to stop importing food. Rations, already meager during the war, would have to be cut to near starvation levels. Industries would have no raw materials. Mass unemployment would follow. Social collapse was possible. There was only one option: beg. In September 1945, a dying John Maynard Keynes boarded a ship for Washington. He was exhausted, ill, suffering from a serious heart condition. He was the greatest economic mind of his generation, but he was sailing to America not as an intellectual equal, but as a supplicant on a mission of desperation. Keynes believed he had a moral case. Britain had fought alone for 2 years while America remained neutral. Britain had sacrificed its entire economy to save Western civilization from Nazi tyranny. Therefore, America owed Britain compensation. He called it justice. He asked for $6 billion as a grant, not a loan. A retroactive payment for services rendered to humanity. He called it justice. But in Washington, justice had no exchange rate. The mood in America had shifted. The war was over. Soldiers were coming home. The public was tired of paying for Europe. Politicians were suspicious of Britain's new Labour government, elected on promises of socialism and nationalization. They didn't want American capitalist tax dollars funding British socialist experiments. The American negotiators, led by Fred Vinson, were unmoved by moral arguments. They looked at Keynes coldly and told him, no gift, no grant, only a loan, a commercial loan, with interest. Keynes was devastated. He argued passionately. He warned that crushing Britain economically would destroy a vital ally against the rising Soviet threat. But the Americans held all the leverage. They knew Britain had nowhere else to go. The offer was $3.75 billion, barely enough to survive. And it came with conditions designed to strangle the last remnants of British economic independence. The most destructive condition was sterling convertibility. Within 1 year of receiving the loan, Britain had to make the pound fully convertible into dollars. Anyone holding British pounds could exchange them for American dollars at will. The Americans framed this as free trade and open markets. But it was actually a mechanism to destroy the sterling area. During the war, Britain had forced its colonies and trading partners to accept payment in pounds, but forbidden them from converting those pounds to dollars. This created a closed economic loop. Countries holding pounds could only spend them on British goods. It was a captive market that protected British industry. The Americans wanted to smash that system. They knew that once the pound became convertible, everyone holding pounds would immediately sell them to buy dollars. Because everyone wanted American products. American cars were better. American machinery was better. American goods were simply superior. Keynes knew this condition was suicidal. He knew that the moment convertibility was introduced, there would be a catastrophic run on the pound. The loan would evaporate in weeks. But the alternative was mass starvation. Reluctantly, bitterly, the British Parliament voted to accept the loan. Members of Parliament described it as a financial Munich, an appeasement to avoid immediate disaster. The loan agreement was signed in July 1946. Keynes died just months later, his heart giving out under the strain of trying to save his country from its closest ally. But the tragedy was only beginning. The winter of 1947 was the coldest in living memory. Blizzards buried Britain in snow. Coal supplies froze solid. Power stations shut down. Factories closed. Homes went dark. People huddled under blankets, lighting candles because there was no electricity. In this frozen darkness, the reality of victory became clear. Britain had won the war, but living standards were collapsing. Bread, which had never been rationed even during the worst of the U-boat blockade, was now rationed in peacetime. The age of austerity had begun. Then the clock struck on the American condition. On July 15, 1947, Britain made the pound sterling fully convertible. The result was exactly what Keynes had predicted. It was a financial massacre. The instant the window opened, the world rushed to sell pounds. Countries that had been accumulating sterling for years, India, Egypt, Argentina, immediately dumped it to acquire precious dollars. The American loan, which was supposed to last years, began hemorrhaging away. In 1 month, Britain lost hundreds of millions of dollars. The government watched helplessly as reserves evaporated. They were bleeding to death in real time. After just 5 weeks, 35 days, on August 20th, 1947, the British government was forced to suspend convertibility. They slammed the window shut. They had to return to Washington and admit total failure. They had burned through a significant portion of the loan for nothing. The humiliation was absolute. The British Empire had tried to play by American rules in an American game and had been destroyed. This financial weakness triggered immediate geopolitical consequences. This was the moment when global leadership officially transferred from London to Washington. In February 1947, the British government sent a telegram to the U.S. State Department. It was a message of resignation. For over a century, Britain had been the guarantor of stability in the Eastern Mediterranean, keeping Russian influence out of Greece and Turkey. But now, with the treasury empty, Britain could no longer afford to pay for soldiers or subsidize the Greek government in its civil war against communist insurgents. The telegram essentially said, "We're broke. We're leaving. If you want to stop the communists, you'll have to do it yourselves." This telegram triggered the Truman Doctrine. America stepped in to fill the vacuum. It was the formal acknowledgement that Britain was no longer a superpower capable of shaping global events. It was a regional power struggling to keep its economy functioning. The economic misery continued. In 1949, with the economy stagnant and reserves depleted, the government was forced to devalue the pound. Before the war, £1 had been worth $4.86. In 1949, it was slashed to $2.80. Overnight, the British people became 40% poorer relative to the rest of the world. Imports became more expensive. Living costs rose. It was an admission that British productivity could no longer compete. But here's the truly staggering part. The bill for World War II wasn't just paid in the 1940s. It was a mortgage spanning generations. The Anglo-American Loan of 1946, the money borrowed to prevent starvation after victory, was not a gift. It was commercial debt with interest. Every single year for 6 decades, the British Treasury wrote a check to the United States Treasury. Through the economic boom of the 1950s, through the crisis of the 1970s, through the Thatcher era, through the Blair years, the payments continued. The final payment was made on December 29th, 2006, 61 years after the war ended, 61 years after the victory parades. British taxpayers were still paying for the privilege of having survived World War II. Let that sink in. People born after the war, who never saw a German bomber or heard an air raid siren, spent their entire working lives paying off debt incurred to defeat Hitler. The story of how the U.S. bankrupted the British Empire is the ultimate demonstration that in modern warfare, there are no winners, only degrees of loss. Germany lost the war and was destroyed, divided, and occupied. But Britain won the war and was bankrupted, diminished, and became dependent on American power. The only nation that genuinely benefited was the United States. The American economy doubled during the war. American cities were never bombed. American factories were untouched. The U.S. emerged holding 2/3 of the world's gold reserves and became the undisputed economic superpower. Through the mechanisms of Lend-Lease, the loan agreements, and the base transfers, the United States dismantled the British Empire's economic structure and absorbed its strategic assets. Not through conquest, but through contract. Not with armies, but with accountants. For the British people, the legacy of 1941 left a permanent psychological scar, a sense that the nation's best days were behind it, a feeling of decline that has haunted British politics ever since. This special relationship became the polite euphemism for dependency. Britain remained important, but it was no longer independent. When Winston Churchill wrote that letter to Roosevelt in December 1940, he saved Britain from Hitler. But he also initiated a transaction that would transfer global power from London to Washington. He traded empire for survival. It was a deal that had to be made. There was no alternative. But the cost was Britain's future. Britain emerged from World War II as a moral giant, but an economic shell. It had spent its inheritance to buy freedom for Europe. It was perhaps the noblest sacrifice in modern history. But in the cold arithmetic of economics, it was a liquidation sale. The British Empire didn't fall to invasion. It was sold off, asset by asset, to pay the bill for doing the right thing. The ultimate price of victory was victory itself. I'm ready to tell you the stories they don't teach in history class. Subscribe now, because when the history books are finally honest, you'll want to be among those who already knew the truth.